Welcome to the Art of Being Nimble podcast. I'm Glenn Smith and I'm your host. In this series, we'll introduce you to business leaders from around the world who will interview about how they've overcome challenges of operating a business in today's dynamic world. Through their stories, we're going to hear about what problems they've had and how they fixed them and the benefits it's brought them. Importantly, you're going to learn some lessons about what you can then use in your organisation to do similar things. So let's get on with the show and hear the next story. Workplaces have never been more diverse, not just in background, but also in generations, with baby boomers, Gen X, Millennials and Gen Z all working together. How do you create a learning culture that works for everyone? What motivates one generation might not resonate with another, and the way people prefer to learn and share knowledge has changed dramatically. Today, I'm joined by Andy Lethbridge, the Global Head of Consulting at BAE Systems Digital Intelligence. With over 25 years of experience in business transformation and consulting, Andy has worked with public and private sector leaders to help organisations adapt to change. As the leader of a team of more than 600 consultants, he has seen firsthand how different generations approach work, learning, and leadership. We talk about what it takes to build a learning organisation across generations, how AI and digital twins are changing training, and how companies can create a workplace where knowledge flows freely. It's a fascinating look at the future of learning in the workplace. So, welcome, Andy. Welcome to the show. So let's start off with, how have you observed as a leader the different generations in the business and what's it meant to you as a leader?
Glenn, thanks for having me, first and foremost. It's been a real challenge, if I'm brutally honest, across 4 generations of different types of expectations, different demands, and those sorts of things. It really has been a really steep learning curve. I'm going to be honest, I'm Gen X, just at the tail end. So I grew up with boomer and silent generation leaders. That's my benchmark. That's kind of like my DNA. That's how I've learned. And I guess, so I come into the workplace with a certain set of expectations. I now find myself in a very privileged position, don't get me wrong, but I am leading people who are at the tail end of their career. I am leading similar people to from Millennials into Gen X and now into Gen Z. And it really is a significant variety of expectations and styles that you have to deal with and that you have to manage and also lead, because it's not just that I'm looking after kind of like that 4-generational workforce. It's that other people are having to work, and you've got and I don't mean to use the generational terms in any disingenuous way. It's just their names. But you've got boomers who are now being managed by millennials, who are being managed by, in some instances, high-performing Gen Zers. And that's really hard for people to get their heads around, because the expectations of boomers and the way in which they work and now digital native Gen Zers coming through, it's massive in terms of the expectations. And when we talk about technology usage and technology consumption, you've got some people who just about use email and get their calendar sorted, with now individuals who are coming through who want to communicate via WhatsApp, want to communicate via Signal. We're a secure firm where I work, so yes, Signal is better for us. But also using collaboration tools that are digital in nature. We've moved way beyond the Post-it note, and we're now in things like Mural and those sorts of things. And so that learning environment, that learning dynamic for boomers, and in many cases for kind of like Gen X as well, it's really quite hard and it's really challenging. But there's that expectation with Gen Z that, well, why are you just not doing it? Why are you just not using it? So creating that balance and creating the environment where the right expectations are set and everybody's potential can be achieved regardless of how you interact with technology or regardless about how you want to work. It's been a real challenge just navigating that, and it will continue to be a real challenge. It's not too far before we're going to get Generation Alpha into the workforce. So that's a 5-generation workforce. And a real challenge.
So you talked about creating that environment, but I guess as a leader of the enterprise, you're creating that environment and supporting that. But I guess your step back as the leader, seeing these challenges occur. What have you noticed for people who are in the workforce themselves? Because they may, if they're working, they're going to maybe not be thinking through the same lens that you are, and having conflict when there's those generational challenges.
I'm going to use the word a lot, and I will make no apology for that. It's around that expectation. And you're right. In the midst of delivery of work for our clients, for our customers, oftentimes in high stress environments, people will default to their natural behaviors. And for I guess kind of like people like me, we just get on, we just do it. I've been in a service environment in professional services for well over 25 years now. And it's part of that DNA for that generation the clients ask for it, we just have to get on, we just have to do it. And there's sacrifice and there's compromise, because you understand that it's that cycle. I'm sure you've experienced that with your agile projects as well. And so for boomers, for Gen X and kind of like early millennials, it's just you just get on and you crack on and do it. Then that conflicts with some of the later millennials and Gen Zers coming through who have seen their parents do this, and they do. I think they resent that expectation of that the customers just think it's just going to happen. It's just going to get done because I've asked for it, and that's in no way, shape, or form suggesting that they are lazy, because they're not. All of the millennials and Gen Zers that I work with, they are all fiercely ambitious. They want to achieve, but they also don't want to necessarily sacrifice and compromise their entire work-life balance because they've seen their parents do it. And that's a really interesting dynamic. And don't get me wrong, when the pressure hits, everybody generally pulls together, but you do see some of those generational traits just creeping in. And you might have people who might want to leave at 6 and other people who are working until 9. And the people who are working until 9, so why are you leaving at 6? We haven't got this done yet. And it's, well, no, as long as, and I guess where we're coming to now, it's getting to that point, which is if the work gets done, we should be less dogmatic about the time, the presence, the visibility, and we have to focus on the outcomes. And if everybody is focused on the outcomes, then we can mitigate some of that generational dogma about how we should be working and how we should be presenting ourselves. And in terms of individuals, it becomes the leader and the manager's position just to make sure that conflict never really appears, because we are managing the work in the right way and we are delivering the outcome in the right way. I've kind of like feathered around the edges a little bit, but hopefully that kind of like answers some of the question.
Yeah. And I was thinking as you were talking, you talked about the generational dogma and you talked about the presence of being there. There was the old thing. I remember, Dan must be in at X o'clock and leave at Y o'clock. And it was almost the physicality of being in the building was the important thing. Whether you were providing any value in that time was another thing. And so we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the differences that comes from the generations. But it's not all bad, is it? So having 4 generations in your business, you're going to have diversity of thinking and working approaches. How has that been beneficial to the business?
I think it's created that, as you say, that diversity of thought. I remember back when I first started all those years ago, thinking that I knew everything, and I was probably that ambitious oik, constantly pushing the barriers, constantly wanting to accelerate. And I don't think that's changed in reality. It's just my perspective has changed in terms of the level of understanding and the level of experience. I actively encourage people to push and to challenge. There's a brilliant book by Sam Conliffe called "Be More Pirate," and it's one of the texts that I encourage people to read. And that is about kind of like pushing the boundaries, but doing it in the right way. And I think as we mesh them together, we are finding that getting that blend of experience and youth is a really powerful cocktail. It really is. And I actually think kind of like the way in which our Millennial and Gen Z colleagues want to work is having quite a profound impact on how I've certainly looked at things and the choices that I'm making. And again, that's a good thing, because you're absolutely right. It's not all bad, and we can't look at it in a bad light, because this is just how it's going to be. It's not going to change, and so we do have to accept. But it does come back to that compromise, and that compromise has to be bi-directional, which is really important. I think one of the big things for me is about creating that environment where our more senior colleagues, our more experienced colleagues, aren't dismissive because of the way in which Gen Z work. And by enabling learning, which, don't get me wrong, I'm sure we'll cover the fact that COVID has had a huge impact in a professional services context about how people learn and how people develop and grow the experience. But we need to figure that out. But we also need to be very, very accepting that how the Millennials and the Gen Zers think and challenge and then do work in this new digital native way, and how we pull that through, that's absolutely critical. Because, yeah, exactly to your point, it's not all bad. There is so much goodness in blending all of that together and creating that in that almost co-creation environment for work and moving forward.
So what leadership practices have you found useful to create that co-creation, belonging, collective way of working so that everyone actually plays nicely?
So it's a really interesting question. This is very much my leadership style. People have to navigate it themselves. But
of course,
I'm very much open door. I try not to have kind of like the old school outer office. Yes, I'm in the fortunate position where I have somebody manage my diary. That's because I'm completely incapable of doing it myself. I create conflicts all over the place, and I do feel for my EA on a daily basis. But it's very much open door, and I want to create that environment that is everybody's approachable. I'm fortunate enough to work in an organisation that is hugely collaborative. Genuinely, too many organisations and too many senior people, I think knowledge is power, whereas actually the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of learning, the sharing of experience, especially in the professional services context, that's where the power lies. Because the sooner that we can get our less experienced colleagues exposed to some of the challenges that we've all been through to get the video, get the T-shirt, get the scars, get the war stories, that gives them greater credibility and greater utility. So we have to do that. So that leadership style for me is I try to do week notes. Over the last 2 years, I've probably written about coming up to 100. I must admit it's tailed off a little bit, so I need to hold myself accountable to that. But that's a little bit of a conscious stream of thought for me, which I broadcast to the entire population. It's about 600-700 consultants. And it creates another avenue, another channel for people to respond and engage with me directly as kind of like the consulting leader. And I think hopefully that sets a tone. We have a number of other channels through our structures that enable access to senior people. And we also have a lot of forums where we try to bring people together, whether that be virtual or whether that be physical. And all of those things, it's about creating that collaborative environment, that sharing environment. But I also encourage other people to challenge and to bring new ideas. At times I do have to say no. I don't necessarily enjoy it, but we do have to say, no, that's a step too far. We can't quite do that, or not yet. It's very much a yet question, or it's yes, and can we do that? Or is it yes, and should we do something along these lines? So there's a lot of coaching and a lot of, I guess, in some ways mentoring as well. And we're trying to drive that through the organization. And then going back to kind of like the book that I've mentioned, as I say, I do encourage people to challenge, to push those boundaries, but also to be accepting of the fact that there will be compromise, and at times you will get told no. And I talk a lot about, I don't want to diminish ambition, but we just have to be cognizant of the ability, organizational ability, teaming ability and individual ability to be able to achieve those sorts of outcomes.
Yeah, and it's interesting you were talking about the knowledge is power. That doctrine, I don't think, has been valid for some time. With the immediacy of data through, when we used to Google everything, now we ask ChatGPT for everything. Actually, the knowledge is much more accessible, and particularly in your industry and mine. We're both in professional services. Actually, a lot that knowledge of how to execute, how to behave is often not written down. It becomes part of the organizational culture and the ecosystem just through the behaviors that exist. It's important to make a successful organization to do that. So let's start thinking about learning then. So how have you overcome that challenge of knowledge is power, and how have you adapted the team and organizational development processes to encourage learning across those generations?
You talk about doctrine, measures drive behaviors. It's one of those adages that is persistent and will continue to be persistent. So within the organization, the competency model that we've established for people to demonstrate progression through the grades, as well as the performance management structure that we have in place which is pretty standard for professional services. We look at people's delivery, so the time they spend with customers. We then look at their contribution back into knowledge development, knowledge capture, whether that be through case studies of work delivery or the tools, methods, knowledge, tradecraft capture that we have. We then build in people management. As you go through the grades, people management becomes a thing that you have to do as a general rule. There are some people who aren't well equipped for it, and so we do make a very conscious choice around that, or an increasingly conscious choice. And then we also have obviously for the professional services firm, we have the business growth. But around that capability development, knowledge capture, and learning and development, we have what we term across the scorecard as we have a quadrant that is very much focused on that, and that starts at the very, very at the entry level. So all of our graduates can get involved in the development of training courses, and in some ways the delivery of those training courses, but obviously the attendance as well. Mm-hmm. But we don't outsource our training from a consulting perspective. We simply can't. I don't want another organization to tell me how my consultants should do the work. I want us to learn that, because that's how our company does consulting, how our company works with its customers. That's unique to us, and any professional services firm would rightly say that. And so I actively encourage, in some ways I demand, that as our more senior staff do that training, do that development, and then that filters down and that feeds down. So there's that one, which is, as I say, kind of like the measure driving the behaviour. But as I say, it's also in our heritage across the organisation. And as I said earlier, I'm very, very fortunate that I work in such a collaborative organisation. It just, a lot of it happens by default. But I also encourage people to be free and open. And I think that comes through in all of the content that gets delivered and the accessibility of that content. But it's interesting, just pivoting back to that generational conversation just at the minute, that I'm just seeing a little bit of the expectations between different generations, just having a bit of a conflict between what people expect and the bar that they set for themselves and how that is then applied to others. And I think we're in a dangerous position where people their bar is so high, but they're not willing to necessarily accept that other people aren't there yet. So I come back to that yet question. And we do have to be tolerant that people will make mistakes. Yes, we have to get that balance right. And there are times and places to make mistakes or to ask the silly questions, especially in a professional services firm that spends an awful lot of time client side working as mission partner in so many different areas. But we as senior leaders and as leaders and managers, we do have to be tolerant of the fact. I made plenty of mistakes when I was younger, and I learned and I learned from them. And I think we have to create that learning environment and be tolerant of that failure. And obviously the old adage is failing to learn is the failure. Failing is absolutely fine, but if you can fail productively and you can learn from that and not repeat it, then that's learning and that's all goodness. But that tension, I am seeing that exhibited a little bit, where people who have got the muscle memory, who can do stuff on autopilot and just by default expect others to be able to do that. It's kind of, well, no, we have to equip them to be able to do that. I'm fiercely protective of people's potential, because I will always see potential. Yes, absolutely. There are some times where performance isn't right, and we have to accept that and make calls around that. But as a general rule, as long as our more junior staff are demonstrating the right behaviours and are demonstrating the right attitude, which is a general rule they do, we have to reciprocate that with our ability to share and help learn and grow and pull people through.
You talked there about the sort of curse of knowledge. You almost forget that what you know, and therefore assume everyone else to know it, and you can get very grumpy with the other person when they don't know what you know because you've not told them. So I think it's great that in your organisation you have that culture of creating that reusable knowledge, and you talked about creating training and case studies, etc. How have you found the organisation need to adapt its style of what it creates and how it shares that? Because across those generations, there's very different learning styles about how people want to consume and reflect, and then ultimately use that information to solidify it. Because going in is one thing, getting it back out again and actually applying it is another.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen a huge evolution of that over time, and a massive acceleration in probably the last 18 to 24 months with the advent of artificial intelligence. But if I look back to when I started, a lot of the training courses were physical. They were face-to-face. There was a lot of role-playing. I had to get very comfortable with role-playing when I was in my formative consulting time. It wasn't necessarily something that I enjoyed, but you just kind of had to throw yourself into it. Mm-hmm. And that's still there. That physical face-to-face role-playing scenario analysis is still absolutely critical. But the access to information, as you mentioned earlier, the access to information is so vast now. When I was just starting out, the internet, I'm going to sound really old now, but the internet was just starting to come through, and it was a bit of it was more marketing, and Wikipedia hadn't started. But now you look at it, you can effectively run an MBA by watching YouTube videos, almost. So we have to make use of that. We absolutely have to make it, but we have to make it relevant, and we have to make it consistent with the way in which we do things. So there's a lot of goodness in there, and we do actively encourage people to go and source those sorts of things. Even this morning, I was watching a video about capability modelling, which provided a little bit of learning for me. And there's some stuff in there that talent borrows, genius steals, as the old adage goes. So we have to do that. I mentioned earlier about COVID and the hybrid working environment and the different expectations now. We've had to bridge into a much more virtual learning environment. Yeah. When we think about sustainability as well, we are a geographically distributed organisation, and when we think about sustainability and we think about carbon footprint, it's not practical to get everybody together all the time. So we do have to think about different ways of delivering training, and delivering training via video is quite hard. We're on that learning journey because people don't want to just click through and sit through and be broadcast to via a PowerPoint. We have to make it interactive. We have to make it interesting and engaging. Otherwise, it becomes a transaction, and that's not where you get deep learning and then kind of like that insight that is repeatable. But one of the big things that we've done now to accelerate the time of effectively kind of like course and scenario creation, because that's a huge effort, and that takes people away from revenue generating work, or they do it in the margins. But we're actually using AI now to create digital twins of organizations which we can run scenarios against. And the speed at which we can generate those scenarios, it has taken a huge amount of stress out of writing the kind of like the modules. And so the focus there is actually on the knowledge share from the individuals who are delivering the course. So the time allowance that we've got to be able to create scenarios at various different levels. We talk about skills levels 1 to 4 across our development pathways. And we can create increasingly challenging scenarios to challenge and test the different levels of competencies that we want to explore and that we want people to develop on. So that's where something like AI has really helped us move from the transactional, the creation, the thought process behind the scenario, the generation of the role profiles, the generation of the role play. That's all automated now. So actually, it's the execution where the value is and where people can spend time. And that's we're going to continue to develop that, but that's been absolutely huge. And that's shown the development through. Historically, it would have taken us 4 or 5 weeks to get to the point at which we've got a course that we can deploy. That's now 4 or 5 days. So that's huge.
Which is quite a substantive improvement.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like, therefore, you have invested quite a lot in both technology. So you mentioned AI, but I'm thinking in my mind, if you go from a traditional course that went online, it was just a recorded video and some slides, to interactive learning platforms. But it also sounds like you've needed to invest in people's skills or dedicated people with sort of a learning and development ethos or mindset to help create that, to make them effective, given the distributed nature, but also the generational desires.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's the demonstration of our willingness to change the dynamic and to use a particularly consulting term, to change the learning paradigm in terms of as you say, the technology that we're using. It demonstrates to our more junior colleagues, to the people coming through, that this is an environment that can change, that is willing to change, that wants to change, that necessarily needs to move with the times. It has to. We have to stay at least comparable with our customers. But it also creates an environment where, slightly disingenuous term, but our more tech adjacent colleagues who don't necessarily want to engage with some of the more technology, that there is an environment that is safe for them to kind of almost take the plunge, so to speak. So yeah, it's good across all of those generations that we are using and exploiting the capabilities that are now available to us in a way in which is consumable regardless of your heritage or your digital nativeness or whatever.
Earlier on, you talked about, and I like the term, you were creating a digital twin of the organisation. So was that your organisation or your clients' organisations?
So it's the client organisations.
Right.
So it's a completely fictitious organisation, but is designed on or around kind of like a public sector structure. Our the vast majority of our professional services work is done into the public domain, and so we've created the structure, we've created the kind of like the role profiles, and you can generate these off kind of like pretty much any organisation charts for any of the government departments. In reality, they're all pretty structured in pretty much the same way. But then you can also build in some of the frameworks. So you've got the Sapphire framework that you can build in that shows the different skills at the different levels of the organisation. We've built that in. And then you've got the DDAT framework in terms of skills that we've also built into the organisation. We've got a lot of knowledge. I need to be very, very clear. We haven't taken any of the client documentation that we get exposed to in our deliveries to use. We've just used kind of like exemplar, let's say, digital platforms, and then we've generated completely fictitious names. Digital Fortress is a particularly fond name for AI to generate and give a name to a system in the public sector. I don't know why, but having created that organization, as I say, we can then run different scenarios. We can run a scenario that says they've got a very legacy mainframe-based environment and they want to move it to cloud. So what's the scenario? How would you go about? In some ways, we can go across the full life cycle as well. So we can go from pitch, bid response, right the way through to delivery into stakeholder management, and we can generate the stakeholder map from the AI the AI will tell us, well, this particular person is a little bit nuggety. They're very precious about their own domain. They don't like sharing knowledge. And then you've got other styles of people who like having conversations. We'll talk for England, and we can generate all of the scripts and those sorts of things. So as I say, it enables us to kind of like really challenge our people in a safe environment, but with increasingly realistic scenarios. And one of the great things about this actually is that it's going to be consistent and it's going to be persistent through all of the career pathways, because with this capability, as when you're a graduate, you'll come in and you'll get exposed to this organization, but then you'll grow with the organization in terms of the different challenges that they've got, and it will just stay consistent all the way through. So all of the courses that you get, it's just, oh, I remember doing that down there, and we can build that into the cycle of challenge across the piece.
I like how you articulate you've got that golden thread through all of it, and that brings it all back to a common idea. So we talked about the operational and leadership challenges and benefits of the different generations. We've talked about that we need to create reusable knowledge and that the learning styles are different. But operating and learning is one thing, but we then need to also be able to think differently and, use that cliche terms, critical thinking. How have you noticed that be applied differently across those generations in the organization?
Very much my opinion, but I do worry that whilst there is the vast amount, I'm trying to think of the right language here, there is access to so much information that it's almost reached that point, certainly for the people who are digital natives, that it's information overload. And as a result of that, actually, they take at face value what they hear first. Not in all cases, and I don't mean to use it as a sweeping generalization, but if I'm going to use my son as an example, he spends a lot of time on digital platforms, TikTok, YouTube, whatever. When we're having a chat at the dinner table, he'll have seen something on YouTube and he will say it and he will announce it as fact.
Yeah.
My wife and I will sit there and we'll go, are you sure about that? And he goes, yeah. X person said it, so it must be true.
He's got so many thousand followers.
Yeah, exactly. He's got 1 million followers and he's saying this, so it must be true. And I do worry that we are not necessarily educating out, but we are not educating in that critical thinking. My daughter, who is a little bit older doing GCSEs, I think it's starting to come, but it's almost having to be relearned as a skill as she goes through her A levels, and that's worrying for me. And so the ability to analyze, critically assess the information that you've been given, rather than just taking it at face value that it is the truth. Certainly from my perspective, I always look at the motivation, and I encourage people to look at the motivations. When I'm talking to our graduates, indeed last week I was presenting to them around personal effectiveness, and one of the conversations was around really challenging stakeholders. It's just, well, you need to understand the motivations, because what they're saying to you might be being driven by something else. And it's that critical thought process that takes into consideration different perspectives, different volumes of information that you're able to process and then come to assumptions and conclusions that you are then willing to test, but critically that you are willing to have proven wrong. And I worry that without that critical thinking, people are, and this is a general rule actually across the piece, but people are increasingly unwilling to be wrong and to be told that they're wrong. Now, don't get me wrong, there are different ways to give constructive criticism, and indeed, not many people know how to deliver that well. And that's a skill that absolutely has to be learned. It absolutely has to be taught. But on the flip side of that, you've also got the willingness to accept that criticism, the willingness to accept that actually you can be wrong. And I find that linked with the critical thinking. If you can carry out your critical thinking and you can almost dissect the argument or dissect the whatever you've been told and go away and research it and almost prove yourself wrong, and challenge yourself, that's a hugely powerful thing, hugely powerful. But I do worry that it's lacking, and it's, as I say, it's not being educated in. And so we're having to remediate that, and we're having to create the environment that there's a lot of talk about safe spaces. Absolutely, you have to have a safe space. But within that safe space, going back to something that we said at the very top of the call, it's around that willingness to compromise and that willingness to accept that you could be wrong. And if you are wrong, to understand why and then explore that through. And as I say, we're having to work on that. And when I look at one of the training courses that we run against that digital twin, it was really hard for across the generations, because we had a mix of generations on that training course, and it was really hard for them to get some of the feedback that they were given. And again, we had to reflect on how we delivered it, but we also had to work with them, and it was the subject of a number of my week notes around how people accept criticism, how people accept that you didn't do something wrong. And that then loops all the way back into failing to learn through failure is a failure in and of itself. And it's such a powerful thing to have that self-awareness to be able to accept criticism, because often and frequently with customers as well in a professional services environment, it's not personal. And as long as you assume good intent, which is what this is generally, don't get me wrong, I'm sure you and I have both had some clients who have gone a little bit personal and have kind of like taken it out on us. But certainly when we look at it internally, it's assume good intent, because we want you to develop, we want you to grow, and we want you to achieve your potential. So I'm conscious I've kind of like swayed around a lot there, but that critical thinking and that critical analysis has such profound impacts on people's ability to learn and develop and grow, both from an external input perspective, but also from an internal growth perspective as well. Hugely profound.
And I think as you're articulating that desire to want and welcome feedback, whether that's constructive, whether it's improvement, exemplary, whatever, is a key part to that. As you were talking, there was something that came to my mind of particularly across generations, because typically, and it's this is a stereotype, but across the more senior by age a person is, the chances are they are more senior in an organizational structure. And I know that's done. You gave some examples where that wasn't the case, but that can create some challenge just generically in an organizational hierarchy of that challenging assumptions and directions. But what came to my mind was what the airline industry has been using for a long time, which is crew resource management, which is about how the first officer can challenge the captain to make sure that if they're misreading, if they think there's a problem regarding the flight path or from a safety point of view, to say it is okay, we are ganging up on the problem, not each other, to do that. How have you helped to foster those sorts of debates across those generations and allow that healthy criticism of ideas and application to occur?
It's interesting. I'll probably loop back around into the critical thinking piece as well. It's within any workshop environment. It's about leaving your grade at the door. It's about removing the hierarchy from those conversations. There's a great phrase in any workshop environment, you are limited by the smartest person in the room, or you're limited by the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. And so one of the things that I try to do is, and I don't always succeed, but I do try to be the last person to speak, not the first, which is really hard for me because I'm a complete megalomaniac, as I'm sure you're realizing. But also I encourage the challenge. But critically, what you have to do, I think, as a leader, and I can imagine a couple of people listening to this call thinking, yeah, all right, Lethbridge, you talk a good game. But it's also recognizing where you are wrong and admitting it. As a leader, if I can admit when I'm wrong, it creates the environment for where other people can be wrong. A very recent example was we're doing some work around our job architecture at the minute, and a couple of weeks ago, one of my very close colleagues said something to me, which I think I inadvertently brushed off, and then when we were having another conversation about it, I thought I'd come up with this amazing idea to say, oh, right, let's smash these two things together. And they just sat there and they looked at me and went, I said that to you 2 weeks ago. And I went into my mind landfill. I don't have a mind palace, I have a mind landfill. And I was filtering through all of it. And I thought, oh, crap. I just completely mansplained, thinking that I'd come up with this genius idea. And I was in a world of recrimination, but I was profusely apologetic about it because it was wrong of me to have dismissed it 2 weeks ago and then tried to manufacture it as my idea. but with that, that's where it comes back to that self-awareness and that willingness to be wrong. And when I was talking about the education, there's a brilliant little story by Sir Ken Robinson, a brilliant TEDx story where he's talking about a little girl in the class who is doodling. She should be listening to the class, but she's doodling in a picture, and the teacher quite rightly goes over and says, what are you drawing? And the little girl says, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher says, but nobody knows what God looks like. The little girl, without missing a beat, just looks up and says, they will in a minute. And it's such a brilliant story, because the teacher's there saying, well, you can't do that because nobody knows. But the child was willing to be wrong, quite frankly. And in reality, it doesn't matter. And Sir Ken Robinson tells the story far better than I do. But as we go through education, actually, you're not encouraged to be wrong. You're encouraged to be right, and you are measured on being right, and you are told that you have to be right. So we educate it out, and where I'm at now is kind of like trying to, as I say, kind of like unpick all of that 12, 13, 14, 15 years worth of educational conditioning that being wrong is wrong.
Yeah.
Actually, no, being wrong is where growth happens. It's where learning happens, and we have to get back to that.
So have you, as an organisation, used any particular frameworks to help promote that unique critical thinking and the diversity across the generations?
If I'm honest, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that anything really exists yet about how to remediate, as I say, that educational conditioning and kind of like bring it out. I think first and foremost, it's about effectively leading by example. That's probably the biggest thing that any organization can do. And that comes with your own leadership frame of reference. And I know I'm name dropping a little bit now, but I do subscribe an awful lot to what Simon Sinek says about leaders eat last and all of those sorts of things. And that leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about taking care of those in your charge. And I do set my stall out to do that, and I try to encourage all of our leaders and our managers to exhibit that type of behaviour. But I also think the competency model that we've put in place as well helps people to understand and identify their journey to maturity across those sorts of things. Our competency model, don't get me wrong, it's probably potentially too prescriptive. At times, but I think as we mature, I think it's important that you at least have that really broad frame of reference across everything about what the expectations are at those grades. And I think building that in and working that through our career pathways and your growth as individuals, I think that's probably the other framework that we are able to hold people to account to in terms of how they work and how they grow and how they develop those skills. Particularly around critical thinking, I think that comes back to the training that we have to do, the scenarios and the situations that we put people into to then allow them to explore in a safe space, so that they've then got that kit bag and that tool set to when they are with clients to then go and deploy it. So I think it's probably those three things. Probably also sounds a little bit fluffy, but I think that's where we've gone.
Brilliant. I think that's really great that you and obviously use the language lead by example, but it strikes me as that, where people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. And so actually by demonstrating the right behavior that you want, your directs learn it, and then it happens by cascade. Brilliant. So that's brilliant. So Andy, this has been a really interesting conversation. I guess, do you have any closing thoughts or recommendations for people? Because obviously you're an amazing leader for sure, but you're not going to be unique. Many organizations are going through this. What would your closing thoughts and recommendations be for people in your perspective or your position with these 4 generations?
I don't consider myself to be an amazing leader, but one of the things that I do hope I do is I continue to learn and I continue to appreciate all of the feedback that I give. I will say I'm a Capricorn. I'm the youngest of 3. I am hopeless at receiving feedback. So I know it's a weakness. So I've created that self-awareness where I try to be as open to it as absolutely possible, but I'm still a work in progress. I think it comes back to expectations and that compromise. And that compromise absolutely has to be bi-directional. The expectations of our millennials, of our Gen Zs, they're perfectly legitimate expectations. Some of us might look at them and think, no, that's completely unrealistic. But understand the motivation behind that expectation, understand what's driving it. But also critically, we need to see the right level of compromise kind of like coming up as well, in terms of the attitudes and the behaviors that we would want to see. It's going to be a very, very fine balance, and it's going to be one that we have to continue to navigate and learn and iterate. But the other thing to do is always assume good intent. It's a mantra that I'm starting to live by. And if we can do that, at least we're coming at it from a positive perspective, rather than that negative of, you don't understand us, so we're not going to do it. And we don't understand you, so we're not going to do it. If we have that, we'll have that constant conflict, which is just going to be really detrimental to that safe space and to that collaborative working environment. But assume the good intent, be willing to compromise, be willing to understand. That's got to be the starting point for me.
Fabulous. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Andy. It's much appreciated. It's been an interesting conversation, and I think there's some great advice there for many people.
Super. It was great to be here, Glenn. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I've had fun making it. I'd be thrilled to hear your feedback or suggestions for topics you'd like me to explore. Email the show at podcast@nimbility.co. You can also check out all the other episodes in the series at nimbility.co/podcast. If you've enjoyed the content, it would mean a lot to us if you could subscribe and rate the show in your podcast app. Your support helps others discover the show and allows us to keep spreading the word. So until next time, thanks for listening.